A waitress laid her last few coins out across the counter, counting each one with trembling hands, while the entire diner fell silent and watched. The man standing right behind her, the one no one in half this city dared to name aloud, looked down at that little pile of change and felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't the coins. It wasn't the line of people piling up behind her. It wasn't the flush burning across her cheeks under the pale light. It was something he didn't see in that handful of money, and that one absent thing crushed a part of him he thought he'd buried long ago. Because 26 years earlier, a woman just like her had counted out coins exactly the same way, under a light just as cold. And that woman was his mother. Donovan Mercer hadn't let a single tear fall since the morning he lowered his mother into the ground. Yet now, in front of a complete stranger, the thing he'd kept locked away for 26 years began to crack, and he knew that tonight, something in his life was about to change forever. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone you think needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, so you never miss the healing stories still to come. Her name was Della Hartwell, and at that moment, she still didn't know who the man standing behind her was. All she knew was that table number 7 had just walked out without paying, leaving behind a bill of $43.72, which, according to the restaurant's rules, had to be covered by the server responsible for that table. 4 customers had eaten their fill, laughing and talking loudly for a full hour, and then, while she turned back toward the kitchen to get their dessert, they had quietly stood up and vanished through the glass door. The evening shift manager, a cold-faced man who cared only about the final numbers at the end of the day, told her in a voice that didn't even bother to look her in the eye that the money would be deducted from her pay, or she could cover it herself right then. Della didn't argue. She had never argued. Arguing was a luxury reserved for people who still had choices, and she had forgotten the feeling of having choices a very long time ago. She silently opened her faded cloth wallet, the same wallet whose strap she had sewn back together with needle and thread 3 times, and poured everything she had onto the icy counter. A few crumpled bills she had been saving for weekend rent. Then came the coins. She gathered them from the bottom of her wallet, from the pocket of her apron, even from the small compartment where she kept loose tips, counting each one with fingers stiff and numb after 12 straight hours on her feet. 25 cents, 10 cents, 5 cents, 1 cent. She arranged them into neat little stacks, as if orderliness could make up for scarcity, as if, by counting carefully enough, the numbers might somehow multiply on their own, but they didn't multiply. She counted them a second time, then a third, and every time, the total still stopped at $41.50. She was short $2.22, $2.22 that she didn't have. Not in any pocket of that emptied wallet, not anywhere on her person. Her cheeks burned hot, not because she was ashamed of such a small amount of money, but because she knew exactly what those $2 meant to her. They were a carton of milk for the morning. They were half a strip of medicine she had to buy every week. They were the thin, fragile distance between holding on and collapsing. Behind her, the line began to grow longer. Someone sighed impatiently. Someone else muttered under their breath. Della lowered her head even more, and her shoulders trembled once, very faintly, but she didn't cry. She had learned long ago that tears didn't pay a single bill, so she held them back, kept them locked in some deep, hidden place where no one could see. She opened her mouth, about to tell the manager that she would bring the missing amount in the morning, that she promised, that she had never owed anyone even 1 cent. But before the plea could leave her lips, a hand rested gently on the counter right beside her little stacks of coins. The hand wasn't hurried. It wasn't showy. It simply placed down the exact amount she was short, neatly and quietly, then withdrew. Della looked up. The man standing behind her was tall, dressed in a dark suit, so plain it was almost invisible. The kind of plainness only people with real power dared to wear. He didn't look at her with the pity she knew too well, that kind of look that made a person feel smaller than even the money they lacked. He looked at her as if she were his equal, as if he was the one she had allowed to do something. He didn't say it was all right. He didn't say he understood. He didn't say a single word about money, about kindness, or about his own generosity. He only gave a faint nod, so small it almost wasn't there, then said in a low, calm voice that she didn't owe him anything, that sometimes a person simply happened to be standing in the right place at the right moment. Della opened her mouth, but her throat tightened. She wanted to thank him, wanted to ask his name, wanted to say that she would repay him no matter what. but all she could do was look into his eyes dark and deep, holding something she couldn't name, an old sorrow that had turned to ash and yet still burned quietly underneath. And in that moment, when their eyes met, she had a strange feeling, vague and yet unmistakable, that this unknown man wasn't seeing a waitress counting coins. He was seeing someone else, someone who had been gone from him for a very long time. The man's name was Donovan Mercer, and in this city, that name was something people spoke softly, avoided speaking directly, or said by choosing not to say it at all. He didn't own buildings with his name fixed to the roof, didn't appear in newspapers, didn't shake hands for photographs at charity galas where the wealthy displayed kindness the way they displayed jewelry. His power was the kind that moved silently beneath the surface of the city, through the docks at midnight, through elegant restaurants where diners never knew who truly owned the place, through brief conversations after which some people disappeared and others were allowed to live in peace. That night, after leaving the small diner on the old street, Donovan slid into the back seat of the polished black car waiting by the curb, and the loyal driver who had followed him for many years simply waited in silence. There was already another man sitting inside the car, one of his subordinates named Reyes, sweat beading on his forehead though the March night was bitterly cold. Reyes had just ruined something that should have been very simple, and he knew it so clearly that his hands kept clenching together on his knees. Donovan didn't shout. He had never needed to raise his voice, because truly frightening men never had to speak loudly. He only looked at Reyes for a long while in silence, a silence heavy as a sentence still hanging over the man's head, then asked in a low, flat voice whether he knew what Donovan had seen tonight. Reyes stammered that he didn't. Donovan said he had seen a woman counting every coin to pay a debt that wasn't hers, while 4 people with enough money to eat their fill had walked out without paying, and he wondered what kind of man would allow such a thing to happen on his own territory without even knowing it. He said that if Reyes wanted to keep working for him, there was one thing he had to understand. One thing Donovan would say only once, that he didn't care how hard Reyes was with hard men, but if he ever heard that Reyes had used his weight against someone weaker, someone with nothing to fight back with, then Reyes would no longer have any place in Donovan's world. Reyes nodded again, and in the streetlight flickering through the car window, his face turned deathly pale. That was Donovan's private law, the kind of law never written on paper, but memorized by anyone who had followed him long enough. He could be ruthless in a way that made men who thought they were strong relearn the meaning of fear. But that ruthlessness was reserved only for those who preyed on people who couldn't defend themselves. Women, children, the elderly, the poor who had been pushed to the end of the road, the very people the rest of the underworld considered the easiest prey, were the line no one was allowed to cross with him. Anyone who crossed that line would come to understand that there were some things money couldn't buy mercy for. After Reyes got out of the car and disappeared into the dark, Donovan leaned back in his seat, letting the cold of the night seep through the glass, and for the first time in many years, he didn't think about work, didn't think about numbers, deals, or the men waiting for him to make one careless move. He thought about the trembling hands counting coins on the counter, about the way that woman had lowered her head without breaking, and he realized that what had made his chest tighten earlier wasn't pity. Pity was something he could brush aside easily. He had brushed it aside 1,000 times before. What touched him was something else, something deeper, something older, something he thought he had buried with the only woman who had ever taught him what it meant to endure in silence. He closed his eyes for a moment, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw again a thin, fragile figure standing beneath the pale light of a long-ago room, a figure he had not dared to think of for 26 years. The woman who had left before he had been able to take her away from poverty. He opened his eyes, pushed the thought back down to the place where it had always lain, and quietly told the driver that he wanted to return to that diner tomorrow night, not to eat, but only to watch. Della reached the rented room on the 3rd floor of an old building when the clock was already nearing midnight, climbing each step with legs that felt as heavy as lead. But the moment she slid the key into the lock, she heard the sound of small feet hurrying toward the door, and she managed to force a smile onto her face before it opened. Briar stood there, 7 years old, her hair tousled because she should have been asleep long ago, holding a half-finished drawing whose colored ink hadn't completely dried yet. The little girl cried out for her big sister and threw her arms around Della's legs, and all the exhaustion from 12 hours on her feet, all the hurt of counting her last coins in front of strangers, suddenly dissolved inside that tiny embrace. The neighbor who watched the child, a kind old woman who still agreed to keep Briar on the nights Della worked late for a price that was cheaper than kindness itself, gave a gentle nod and returned to her own room. Della carried her sister inside, asking why she was still awake at this hour, and Briar answered in a voice full of excitement that she had to wait so she could show her the picture. It was a drawing of the two sisters standing side by side beneath a huge yellow sun, holding hands, and beside them Briar had added a house with a chimney, the kind of house the two of them had never had, yet Briar drew it again and again in every picture she made. Della sat down on the edge of the bed, pulled the little girl into her arms, and listened as Briar told her about her day at school, about the teacher who had praised her for reading loudly and clearly, about the classmate who had shared half a cookie with her, about the stray cat in the schoolyard that the whole class had named Spot. Della listened to every word as if listening to music, nodding, smiling, asking questions in all the right places, because to her, those small scattered stories from her sister were the only reward waiting at the end of a long day, the thing that reminded her why she still clenched her teeth and kept walking forward. Then she reheated the dinner she had packed from the diner, the employee meal given at the end of her shift, and set it in front of Briar. When the little girl asked why her sister wasn't eating too, Della only stroked her hair and said she had already eaten at the diner, that she was very full, and that Briar should eat so she could grow up strong. It was a small lie she had repeated so many times that she almost believed it herself, a soft lie wrapped inside a smile so the child would never have to feel the weight of everything they lacked. She watched Briar eat one spoonful after another, and her own stomach growled softly, but she ignored it the way she had ignored it 1,000 times before. On the small table pushed against the wall, beneath the weak yellow light, there was a stack of papers she tried not to look at for too long each night, papers filled with numbers that made her heart tighten every time she read them again. Briar was not a completely healthy child like the sun-filled drawings she made. There was an illness quietly growing inside that small body, something that needed steady treatment, doctor visits, prescriptions, and sums of money that, to a waitress working double shifts, still seemed like a mountain she could never finish climbing. That was why Della took extra night shifts even when her back ached until it felt numb. That was why she mended her wallet instead of buying a new one. That was why she gathered every loose tip and calculated every cent as if each coin might be the one that saved her sister's future. She had never let Briar see that fear. In front of her, Della was always the sister who could move mountains, the sister who always knew everything would be all right. That night, after Briar had fallen into a deep sleep, one hand still clutching the corner of the drawing of the house with the chimney, Della sat silently on the edge of the bed for a very long time, watching her sister's peaceful face in the dark, and whispered softly into the emptiness that she would find a way, that no matter what it cost, she would find a way. Though at that moment she still had no idea that the way, in a shape no one could have expected, had already begun walking quietly toward both of their lives. The following evening, exactly as he had told the driver, Donovan returned to that small diner, but this time, he didn't walk straight to the counter. He chose a hidden table in the corner, where the light couldn't quite reach, ordered a cup of black coffee, then let it slowly go cold without ever touching it, and he sat there watching. He watched the way Della moved between the tables, quick but never frantic. He watched the way she bent down to the eye level of a crying child to soothe him, instead of frowning the way the other servers did. He watched the way she secretly slipped an extra slice of bread onto the plate of an old man sitting alone, without charging him for it, doing it so quietly that even the old man himself didn't notice. He watched her smile at every customer even though her eyes were heavy with lack of sleep. He watched her straighten her back each time she passed the mirror, though he knew that back must have been aching. He hadn't come to approach her, hadn't come to talk, and he wasn't even sure yet why he had come. He only knew that from the moment he had seen those coins on the counter the night before, something inside him had refused to stay still. Something that kept pulling him back like a tide drawn toward the shore by the moon. And as he sat in that dark corner, watching this unfamiliar woman carry an entire long day on her thin shoulders without letting her smile fall, the memory he had imprisoned for 26 years finally overflowed the wall he had built to hold it back. He remembered the nights of his childhood when he sat curled up on a plastic chair in a cheap diner, waiting for his mother to finish her shift. The mother who worked as a waitress with hands always cracked from dishwater and endless hours spent standing. He remembered the night the fat owner shouted in her face just because a customer had complained about nothing in particular. He remembered how she lowered her head and apologized, though she had done nothing wrong. He remembered how the customers sitting there witnessed all of it, yet not one of them spoke up. Not one of them defended the thin woman being cornered simply because she was poor and had no one standing behind her. He remembered himself then, too small, too weak, only able to clutch the hem of her shirt and do nothing. And he remembered how that helplessness had nailed itself so deeply into his heart that it became the thing that shaped the man he would later become. His mother had lived her whole life that way, enduring in silence, yielding until there was almost nothing left of herself, wrapping up her hardship so her son wouldn't have to carry it, and she had left this world in a cramped room before he had grown old enough, strong enough, powerful enough, to take her away from the poverty that had strangled her day after day. That poverty, that helplessness, that silence of an entire room full of people, was the wound he had carried with him into the underworld. It was the reason he built his power on one iron rule: that no one would ever be crushed in front of him without someone stepping forward. Now, sitting in the dark corner, watching Della quietly give away part of a meal, watching her lower her head without collapsing just like his mother had long ago, Donovan understood why he had come back. He understood why his chest kept tightening each time he looked at her. He couldn't save the woman who had left him 26 years earlier. He couldn't turn back time and stand in the middle of that silent room from long ago and order everyone to shut their mouths. But the woman standing there was still here, still fighting, still carrying something heavier than ordinary exhaustion. And this time, he was no longer the helpless little boy clutching the hem of a shirt. He placed several bills on the table, far more than the price of a cup of coffee, then quietly left before she could realize he had ever been there, carrying inside his chest a decision he himself had not yet given a name. 3 days later, just as the diner's lunch crowd had begun to thin, the glass door was shoved open with brutal force, and 4 men stepped inside, bringing with them a heavy silence that made the whole room seem to sink at once. The man in front was a burly brute named Calder, the leader of the protection crew that still roamed this neighborhood collecting what they called protection money, though the only thing anyone truly needed protection from was them. Calder didn't need to speak loudly. He simply strolled up to the counter, tapped his fingers against the wood in a steady, threatening rhythm, then asked the owner in a honeyed voice whether this month's money was ready yet. The owner, a middle-aged man who had kept that small diner on his shoulders for nearly 20 years, went pale, his hands worrying the towel he used to wipe the counter. He stammered that business had been slow this month, that he needed a few more days, that he was asking for an extension. Calder smiled, but that smile was colder than anger, and he jerked his chin toward one of his men. The man slowly walked along the row of tables, reached out, and swept a stack of clean plates to the floor, letting them shatter into pieces at the feet of the remaining customers, who had gone rigid with fear. Calder said this diner had survived this long because of their kindness, and that it would be such a shame if one day there was a fire, or if one of the employees here met with something unfortunate on the way home late at night. He left the sentence hanging in the air, and the weight of it pressed down on everyone in the diner, on the owner, on the 2 waitresses huddled together near the kitchen corner, even on the cook standing frozen in the serving window. Della stood behind the counter, her heart pounding hard, but when she saw the old owner trembling so badly he couldn't speak, when she saw the young coworker beside her beginning to cry, something inside her wouldn't allow her to stay still. She stepped forward, placing herself between Calder and the people weaker than he was, and said in a voice that trembled but stayed clear that no one here was trying to cheat him out of his money, that the owner had promised to arrange it, and he would, and that smashing things would only make it harder for the diner to earn enough to pay. The whole room held its breath. Calder turned to look at her, raising one eyebrow as if he had just discovered something interesting, then stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the cigarette smoke on his coat, and he looked her up and down with the eyes of a predator that had just found new prey. He asked who she was to dare speak up, asked whether she knew who she was talking to. Della held his gaze and didn't step back, though every cell in her body was screaming at her to move away, and she answered that she was only an employee, but she knew the difference between collecting a debt and bullying people who couldn't defend themselves. Those words made the corner of Calder's mouth twitch, and for one moment, the whole diner seemed to think he would strike her. But then he only laughed, a dry laugh more frightening than a fist, and said she had nerve, that it had been a long time since he had met someone who dared stand so straight in front of him. He added that he would remember her face, remember it very carefully, then turned back to the owner and left him with one final sentence. 3 days. No more. After that, He led his men out, leaving behind a diner scattered with broken shards and people who stood stunned into silence. The young coworker rushed over and wrapped her arms around Della, crying as she thanked her for stepping forward. But Della only squeezed the girl's hand softly, her heart sinking because she understood better than anyone that she had just stepped into the sights of a man who never forgot, and that the courage she had just shown might come at a price she had not yet fully measured. Calder kept his word, but in the manner of a man who enjoyed stretching fear out rather than ending it quickly. He didn't wait until the 3 days were over before returning. Instead, he began appearing here and there, sometimes sitting alone for an entire afternoon at the table near the door just to watch Della work, sometimes sending one of his men to lounge on the sidewalk across the street, watching her through the glass like a shadow that refused to leave. He had chosen her as his target. Not the owner, not the diner, but her, the woman who had dared to stand straight before him, because to men like Calder, breaking someone who dared resist was far sweeter than collecting a few scraps of money. One evening, just as Della was carrying a tray out of the kitchen, he blocked her right in the narrow aisle between 2 rows of tables, planting himself there so she couldn't pass, then said in a voice low enough for only her to hear that he had been asking around about her. He said he knew she worked double shifts, knew she was always the last one to leave when the street had gone empty and the streetlights flickered unevenly, some bright, some dim. You knew she walked a long stretch to the night bus stop. He said all of it with the casual ease of a man showing her that he held every step of her life in his hands, and that a woman walking home alone late at night was such a fragile thing. Della stood there, the heavy tray trembling faintly in her hands, and she had to gather every bit of will she had to keep her voice from breaking as she answered that she had nothing to say to him, that she only wanted to do her job. Calder gave a scornful laugh, moved a little closer, and lowered his voice as he said he could make her lose that job with a single whisper in the owner's ear, that he could make sure not one diner in this neighborhood would dare hire her again, that a woman like her, with no money, no power, and no one standing behind her, would have nothing left once her last paycheck was gone. Every word he spoke was a needle driven straight into Della's deepest fear, because he didn't know, or perhaps he had guessed, that this job was not just a job. It was the only thread holding her small world from collapsing, the one thing standing between her and the abyss. She thought of the prescriptions, of the money she had saved 1 coin at a time, of everything that would vanish like smoke if she lost this work, and that fear grew so large it almost swallowed her whole, but she didn't let him see it. She lifted her head, looked him straight in the eye, and said in a voice that was quiet but did not waver that she had worked honestly all her life, that she wasn't afraid of labor, and she wasn't afraid of empty threats, and that if he thought he could make her run, then he had chosen the wrong person. For one moment, Calder's eyes darkened, and the amusement on his face disappeared, replaced by something far more dangerous. He said very softly that stubborn people like her were usually the ones who fell the hardest. Then he stepped back, giving her room to pass with a mocking little bow, as if he had just ended a polite conversation, and walked out of the diner. Della stood motionless in the narrow aisle for a long while after he had disappeared, the tray still in her hands, trying to breathe deeply enough to make her racing heart settle back into its normal rhythm. And when she finally carried the tray to the customer's table, with the well-practiced smile of a working woman, no one in the diner could have guessed that the woman before them had just braced herself to hide a fear that was eating her from the inside. News of what had happened at the diner didn't take long to reach Donovan's ears, because in this city, almost nothing slipped past the network of eyes and ears he had built around himself. And when he heard one of his men report that an extortion crew was squeezing a small diner on the old street, that they had singled out a waitress who had dared to stand up against them, he set down the glass of liquor in his hand without taking a single sip. He asked for the name of the man in charge, and when Calder's name was mentioned, the corner of his eye narrowed slightly, because he knew that kind of man, the kind who built his authority by crushing those who had no way to strike back. The following evening, just as Calder and his men pushed into the diner, intending to continue their usual performance of intimidation, they froze right at the threshold, because the table in the dark corner, the table no ordinary customer would have noticed, already had someone sitting there tonight. Donovan sat there alone, relaxed as if the whole diner belonged to him, and around him, scattered among the customer tables, were several silent faces whose mere presence was enough to make the air turn thick and heavy. Calder was a man of the trade, and men of the trade recognized their own kind with a single glance, so he understood at once that tonight something was very different. Donovan didn't stand. He only made a slight motion with his hand, inviting Calder to sit in the chair across from him, and that seemingly polite gesture carried the weight of an order that couldn't be refused. Calder sat down, trying to hold on to his swagger, but his fingers had already begun to lace tightly together. Donovan didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He only looked at him for a long while, then said in a low, even voice that he had heard someone had recently become confused about his boundaries, and that he had come here to help that man remember where those boundaries were. Calder forced a laugh and asked who Donovan was to interfere in his business. Donovan didn't answer right away. He simply said his own name, once, softly, and that name fell onto the table like a stone dropped into still water, spreading in widening circles that made the color slowly drain from Calder's face. He had heard that name. Every man who did business in the shadows of this city had heard that name, and they all knew what it meant. The arrogance on his face collapsed like a punctured balloon, and he began to stammer that he hadn't known, that he hadn't realized this diner was under Donovan's attention. Donovan cut him off, still in that frighteningly level voice, saying that the problem was not the diner, but the way Calder treated people who couldn't defend themselves, and that this was something he would never tolerate, anywhere, whether the victim had anything to do with him or not. He said that starting tonight, Calder and his men would never set foot on this street again, would never so much as look toward this diner again, and especially would never allow their shadows to touch the woman he had dared to threaten. Every word he spoke was slow, clear, and stripped of anything unnecessary. And it was precisely that absolute calm that sent a chill down Calder's spine, because he understood that a man who didn't need to scream in order to destroy another person was the truly dangerous one. Calder nodded, sweat breaking out along both of his temples, then hurriedly stood and dragged his men out, not daring to look back. From behind the counter, Della had witnessed all of it, and when the man in the dark corner slowly rose to his feet, when the light fell just enough across his face, she recognized him. He was the man who had quietly placed the missing money on the counter for her that night. The man who had looked at her without any pity at all. In that moment, a new and staggering truth slowly became clear in her mind, that the kind stranger from that night was not simple at all, that behind that quiet manner was a kind of power that could make even men like Calder bow their heads, and she didn't know whether she should feel safe or afraid in the face of that discovery. When the diner closed that night, Donovan didn't leave quietly as he usually did. Instead, he waited for Della outside, leaning against the black car parked by the curb, and when she stepped out with hesitation in her face, he simply said that letting her walk alone to the night bus stop after everything that had just happened was something he couldn't feel at ease about, and that he would take her home, with no conditions attached. Della hesitated, because every instinct of self-protection in her had taught her to be wary of kindness from strangers, especially from a stranger who had just shown her how frightening his power could be. But there was something in his eyes, a steadiness with no calculation in it, that finally made her nod. The whole way there, the two of them said almost nothing. There was only the soft hum of the engine and the city lights drifting past the window, but that silence wasn't suffocating. Strangely, it carried a feeling of safety Della hadn't known in a very long time. When the car stopped in front of the old building where she lived, the third-floor window was still lit, and before Della could thank him and leave, the building door flew open, and a tiny figure rushed out. It was Briar. The little girl had stayed awake waiting for her sister, and the moment she caught sight of Della through the doorway, she ran straight to her, wrapped her arms around her sister, then lifted her wide, curious eyes toward the tall man standing beside the car. With the innocence only children have, she asked him directly who he was. Donovan, the man who only a few hours earlier had made someone like Calder turn pale just by saying his name, suddenly found himself awkward before the question of a 7-year-old child. He crouched down until he was at her eye level, a gesture he himself couldn't remember making for anyone in years, and answered that he was a friend of Della's, that tonight they had happened to be going the same way, so he had brought her home. Briar studied him for a while with the almost comically serious expression of a child deciding whether someone deserved to be trusted, then suddenly held out the drawing she had in her hand and announced that it was a picture she had just made, with the 2 sisters and a house with a chimney. Donovan accepted the drawing with both hands, looking at it with real attention, not the false indulgence adults often offered children, then said that this house had the finest chimney he had ever seen, and asked whether there was a fireplace inside to keep it warm in winter. Briar cried out in delight and immediately began chattering about the house of her dreams, about the fireplace, about a kitchen that always smelled of cake, and Donovan listened to every word, nodding, asking questions in all the right places, allowing the little girl to lead him through each room of her imagination. Standing beside them, Della watched in astonishment, watching that frighteningly powerful man crouch on the sidewalk and talk with her little sister as if there were nowhere else he needed to be, as if nothing in the world mattered more than the story of a house with a chimney. And for Donovan, in the moment he looked at Briar's bright eyes as she spoke about her dream. Something inside his chest, something that had been frozen for so many years, began to thaw. He saw in that little girl the shadow of who he had once been, a child with nothing in his hands except dreams drawn on paper, a child who still believed that somewhere out there, a warm house was waiting for him. And he remembered that there had once been a time when he too had dreamed simple dreams like that, before life taught him he had to become hard. When it was finally time for Briar to go inside and sleep, the little girl waved goodbye and called after him that next time he had to come visit again, and Donovan, standing upright in the stillness of the late-night street, heard himself answer that he promised, a promise he had not meant to make, yet one that came from him so naturally, it was as though it had been waiting in his heart for a long time. In the days that followed, Donovan occasionally stopped by the diner during the quiet hours, and little by little, those visits became a silent habit neither of them gave a name to. He sat at his familiar table in the corner. She brought him the cup of black coffee he never fully finished, and in the moments when her hands were free, they talked. But Della was not naive, and after the night she had seen Calder turn pale just from hearing one name, she had quietly asked around, pieced things together, and the truth she slowly assembled left her heart both heavy and tangled. The man who still sat in the corner of the diner where she worked, the man who had spoken so gently with her little sister about a house with a chimney, was also the man half the city mentioned only in whispers, the man who stood at the head of a world she knew only through frightening rumors. The conflict inside her grew larger with each passing day. One part of her was deeply grateful to him, because he had stepped forward to protect her when no one else had done so, had given back to her a sense of safety she thought she had lost, had looked at her and her sister with the eyes of a human being rather than someone handing down charity. But another part of her was afraid. Not afraid of him, but afraid of the world surrounding him, the world of names no one dared say out loud, of dangers she couldn't fully imagine, and she wondered whether a woman who only wanted to keep her little sister safe should allow a man like him to step into her life. One drizzly afternoon, when only a few scattered customers remained in the diner, Della finally let what was in her heart come out. She stood beside his table, her hands clenched tightly together, and asked him directly why he was doing all of this for a stranger like her, that she had nothing to repay him with, and couldn't understand what a man like him could possibly need from a poor waitress. Donovan was silent for a long while, his fingers lightly turning the cold coffee cup, and then he spoke, not looking at her, but out at the rain beyond the glass. He said there had once been a woman in his life who counted coins just like she did, who yielded until there was almost nothing left of herself, who lowered her head and endured without ever complaining. He said that woman had lived an entire life being looked down on simply because she was poor and had no one standing behind her, had borne things no one should ever have had to bear, while the people around her did nothing but turn their faces away. He said he had not been able to do anything for her while she was alive, had not become strong enough in time to protect her, and that she had left him carrying all those silent sacrifices before he could repay even a small part of them. His voice didn't tremble, but inside that calmness, Della could hear a pain cut so deep it no longer bled, a pain that had become part of who he was, and she understood that he wasn't telling her this to ask for pity. He was telling her so she would understand that when he looked at her, he didn't see a waitress in need of charity. He saw a chance to do the thing he had regretted all his life because he had not done it in time. He turned back to look at her and said softly that she didn't owe him anything, that what he was doing was as much for himself as it was for her, and that the only thing he hoped for was that she and her sister could live without fear. In that moment, something between them quietly changed. The wall of caution Della had built began to crack, not because he had saved her, but because for the first time, she saw the real person behind that frightening name, a man carrying a wound strangely similar to her own. And when she silently refilled his coffee cup, a small gesture filled with everything neither of them said aloud, they both felt that something fragile had begun to grow between them, built not on pity or gratitude, but on a deep understanding and respect neither one of them had ever shared with anyone else. Not everyone in Donovan's world was pleased to see their boss changing, and the one most irritated by it was Sutton, a man who had followed him for many years, a man close enough to the inner circle that he had convinced himself he understood Donovan better than anyone else. Sutton had always been ambitious, always quietly believing that his years of loyalty deserved to be repaid with more power, a larger share, and he had waited for the day Donovan would trust him with bigger matters. But instead, in recent weeks, all he had seen was his boss spending more and more time at a cheap diner with an unknown waitress, seen the cold man who had once made the whole city treat him with fear and respect, now driving a poor woman home and talking with a child. In Sutton's eyes, that wasn't kindness. It was a sign of weakness, a crack in the armor that had seemed impossible to pierce, and he looked at that crack not with concern, but with the cold calculation of a man who had begun to smell opportunity. He started paying attention, remembering details, silently watching every time Donovan stopped by the diner, every time he took the waitress home, and he understood that this woman was the weakness he had been searching for all along, something that could be used to shake his boss's position, or worse, to bring him down. Late one night, in a dark bar on the edge of the harbor, a place where the dirtiest bargains were often traded in the shadows, Sutton sat across from Calder himself, the man Donovan had just cornered, and forced to withdraw from that street, with resentment burning inside him. At first, Calder looked at Sutton with suspicion, because he knew this man belonged to Donovan, but that suspicion quickly faded when Sutton lowered his voice and said he wasn't particularly fond of his boss anymore either, that he had things Calder needed, information only someone on the inside would know. Sutton told Calder something the protection boss had never known, that the waitress who had dared to stand up to him was not nearly as ordinary as she seemed, that for some reason, she had become the only thing that troubled Donovan, the fatal weakness of a man who had no weakness. Calder's eyes brightened in the dark as he slowly understood the value of what he had just heard, because he realized he didn't have to face Donovan directly, which would be suicide. All he had to do was aim at that woman, and he could make the man who had humiliated him pay. Two men who had nothing in common except the hatred they both directed at one person began whispering and plotting, and from the darkness of that bar, a trap began to take shape, careful and poisonous, aimed straight at Della. Meanwhile, not far away, beneath the warm light of the rented room on the third floor, Della was sitting with her hands entwined with Donovan's, telling him about a rare, peaceful day while Briar slept deeply with a new drawing in her hand. None of the three had any idea that at the very moment they were savoring that fragile happiness just beginning to bloom. In another dark corner of the city, two hate-filled minds were leaning close together, searching for a way to crush that very peace. Donovan, the man who was always alert to every threat from the outside, never imagined that the greatest danger this time would not come from an enemy, but from someone he had trusted, or that the name of the woman he wanted to protect above all else was being whispered in the dark by men who wanted to use her as a piece on the board to destroy him. The piece inside that small room, therefore, carried a beauty so fragile it almost hurt, because only the viewer knew that it was being counted down, that the storm was quietly drawing near, and that these gentle days were perhaps about to be tested in the cruelest way. The trap Sutton and Calder set was calculated carefully down to every detail, because both of them understood that facing Donovan directly was unthinkable. So instead of attacking him, they decided to smear the woman he wanted to protect, turning her from a victim worthy of shelter into a liar who deserved suspicion. Their plan rested on a truth Sutton knew well, that Donovan valued honesty above everything else, that the only thing capable of making him turn his back on someone was not danger, but betrayal. Calder used his connections to stage an elaborate performance. He had someone approach the owner of the diner where Della worked, fabricating a false ledger along with several expertly forged receipts. Things that seemed to show that over the past several months, large sums of money had been taken from the diner's cash fund, and that all of them matched Della's shifts. He also planted a witness, a man paid to swear that he had seen her with his own eyes, secretly taking money from the drawer on quiet nights. Then, to complete the picture, Sutton arranged for Donovan himself to hear those words by accident, not from the mouth of an enemy, but from sources that appeared objective, so the seed of doubt could be planted in his heart in the most natural way. Every piece was set exactly where it needed to be. One evening, when Donovan came to the diner, the owner, with a miserable face, placed the false ledger and the stack of receipts in front of him, trembling as he said that he didn't want to believe it, but every piece of evidence pointed to one person, that the diner's funds were missing a large amount, and that all of it had happened during Della's shifts. The planted witness appeared at just the right moment as well, stammering through the story that had been prepared for him, with fear convincing enough to make it believable. Donovan sat there, looking down at the evidence spread before him, and for one moment, only one moment, his world tilted. He had placed in this woman something he had not given anyone since the day his mother died: trust. And now everything laid out before his eyes was whispering to him that perhaps that trust had been placed in the wrong hands. The numbers matched one another perfectly. The testimony sounded sincere, and a cold voice from the past rose inside him, the voice that had taught him that trust was weakness, that those who appeared most honest were often the ones hiding the most secrets. In that dark moment, the image of Della lowering her head to count coins, Della giving up her meal for her sister, Della standing with her back straight before Calder, all of it seemed to be covered by a mist of doubt, and Donovan felt a familiar chill crawl along his spine, the chill of a man who had been betrayed by life too many times and had learned to always expect the worst. Hidden in the darkness, watching from a distance, Sutton saw his boss's face darken and knew the trap had closed exactly as planned. He held back a triumphant smile, certain that once Donovan turned his back on the girl, everything would collapse in a chain. The woman who had lost her only protection would be easy for Calder to corner, and the crack in Donovan's heart would become the opening through which Sutton could slip in and seize the thing he had craved for so long. Della, at that moment, still had no idea that her name had been blackened, that false evidence was being displayed to condemn her, that the man she had only just begun to dare trust was sitting not far away with a cruel question slowly growing inside his heart, and that her fate, her sister's fate, and all of the fragile happiness that had just begun to glow were now hanging by the thin thread of a trust being tested to its very end. When the evidence was finally placed in front of Della, when the diner owner, his face filled with pain, held out the ledger and the stack of receipts and asked whether she had any explanation, she stood frozen for a moment, feeling as if the ground beneath her feet had just collapsed. She looked at the numbers that matched every one of her shifts, listened to the accusation from a witness she had never even met, and she understood at once that she was being framed, that someone had carefully built all of this to destroy her. Fear surged through her like floodwater, because she knew exactly what an accusation like this meant. It meant losing her job, losing her last paycheck, losing the fragile thread that kept her small world from falling apart. And worse than anything, it meant losing the trusting look of the man who had only just stepped into her life. But in the middle of that panic, something deep inside Della rose up, something forged through years of enduring and standing firm. And she realized that if she collapsed now, if she let fear control her, then the people who had set this trap would win. She drew in a deep breath, lifted her head, and instead of crying, begging, or frantically denying the accusation the way the schemers had been certain she would, she began to speak in a voice that was strangely calm. She did not deny it in panic, but calmly pointed out each unreasonable detail in the pile of evidence. She said that if she had truly been taking such large amounts of money for months, then why had she still been counting every coin to cover a $40-something bill? Why was she still giving up her own meal for her little sister? Why was her life still so difficult that everyone in the diner could see it? She asked how long that witness had worked at the diner, and when the man stammered and couldn't answer, she said calmly that she had never seen his face during the entire time she had worked there. She asked to examine the ledger closely, and with the eyes of someone who had grown used to calculating every cent in order to survive, she pointed out that the handwriting in those pages did not match the handwriting in the real cash book she had seen the owner use every day, and that there were days marked as her shifts when in truth she had taken time off to bring her sister to the doctor, something the diner's work schedule could prove. Every word she spoke was slow and clear, not the words of a guilty person trying to make excuses, but the words of an innocent person following the truth. And with every sentence, she exposed another crack in the hastily built trap. She never once raised her voice, never once blamed Donovan or begged him to believe her, never tried to use the relationship between them to ask for protection, but relied only on the truth itself and her own dignity to defend herself. And that very thing, that calm refusal to collapse, was what the schemers had never expected. They had calculated everything except one thing: that this woman was not the kind of person who would crumble under pressure, that a whole life spent fighting poverty and contempt had given her a kind of endurance that money and schemes couldn't break. As Della calmly pointed out one unreasonable detail after another, The diner owner began to frown and look back at the evidence with confusion. And more important than anything, Donovan, who still sat silently in the corner watching it all, gradually felt the fog of doubt inside him begin to clear. He watched the way she stood there, alone, without support, facing an accusation that could crush her, and yet still holding on to her honesty and composure, and he realized that a deceitful person could never be that calm, could never point out the holes with such sharp clarity. Her resilience had done what no explanation could have done. It not only saved her in that moment, but also unintentionally revealed to Donovan that the entire thing was a stage trap, and that whoever stood behind it had to be someone who knew his weaknesses very well. That night, after he had taken Della home and reassured her that he believed her, that she no longer had to worry, Donovan sat alone in his dark room with a cold anger coiling inside his chest, the kind of anger that did not flare, but froze, the kind more dangerous than any flame. He slowly fitted together each piece of the picture, and the more he assembled it, the clearer everything became, so clear that he blamed himself for not seeing it sooner. This trap was too refined to be the work of a crude man like Calder. It required a deep understanding of Donovan himself, of the one thing that could shake him, of the fact that he valued honesty more than his own life. Only someone very close to him could have known that Della had become something he cared about. Only someone inside his inner circle could have known his schedule well enough to arrange everything with such perfect timing. And when he followed that thread, it led straight to Sutton. He remembered Sutton's irritated looks whenever he mentioned the diner. Remembered the times the man had seemed far too eager to know where he was going and whom he was meeting. Remembered the way he always appeared at just the right moment to whisper some veiled suggestion about weakness into his ear. Donovan had his people investigate quietly, and within one day, what they brought back confirmed what he had suspected. Someone had seen Sutton meeting Calder at a bar on the edge of the harbor. There had been secret exchanges of money. There were even traces showing that Sutton himself was the one who had hired people to create the false ledger and bribe the witness. When all the pieces finally locked into place, Donovan sat motionless for a long time. And what hurt him was not that Calder, an enemy, had tried to take revenge, but that he had been betrayed by a man he had trusted for many years, a man he had treated like an extension of his own arm. Yet mixed into that anger and bitterness was another feeling, a relief so deep that it surprised even him, because now he knew for certain that Della had never betrayed him, that the woman to whom he had given his trust had been completely worthy of that trust. He remembered the dark moment when the seed of suspicion had been planted in his heart, the moment when he had almost allowed that cold voice from the past to convince him that she was just like all the others who had betrayed him, and he felt ashamed that even for an instant he had let that doubt touch her. But she herself, through her resilience and honesty, had proven her innocence without needing him to speak for her, and that made his trust in her not only return, but grow stronger than it had ever been, like metal that had passed through fire and come out harder. Donovan rose, walked to the window, and looked out over the city swallowed in darkness, and inside his mind, a plan to strike back began to take shape, cold and precise. He would not act in the heat of anger. That was not his way. Instead, he would do what he did best, drive both of those men into the very trap they had built, so they would receive the consequences of their own filthy game. He thought of Sutton, the man who had wagered all his loyalty in exchange for a little ambition, and he thought of Calder, the man who had refused to learn from the last lesson. Both of them had made the same fatal mistake. They had aimed at the woman Donovan had sworn to protect. They had touched the only line no one was allowed to cross, and Donovan, with the frightening calm of a man who always delivered the decisive blow at exactly the right moment, knew it was time to remind this entire city why his name had been whispered in fear for so many years. Donovan did not rush, because a decisive blow was only truly final when it was delivered at exactly the right moment, and he chose that moment perfectly. The first thing he did was dismantle every accusation aimed at Della. He gave the diner owner the real evidence proving the ledger was false, exposed the so-called witness as nothing more than a hired man, and within a single afternoon, Della's name, once blackened, was fully restored to innocence. The diner owner apologized to her again and again, ashamed that he had ever allowed himself to doubt her. Once that was done, Donovan turned his attention to the two men who had dared set the trap. With Calder, he had no need for a noisy confrontation, because he understood that the only thing a man like him truly feared was losing the power he had built on other people's fear. Donovan used his network of influence to tighten every path Calder did business through, every dirty stream of money, every hidden connection, Every person who had once bowed their head before him, one by one, they all turned their backs when they realized he had been foolish enough to oppose a man the whole city feared and respected. Within a few days, the small empire Calder had built by bullying the weak began to collapse. His men abandoned him. The people who had once flattered him now wouldn't even answer his calls. And for the first time in his life, the man who had once made an entire neighborhood tremble tasted the helplessness he had spent so long sowing in others. The final confrontation between them was brief. Donovan found Calder when the man had nothing left in his hands, and he did not need to strike him, did not need to make a single threat. He only looked at him and said that Calder had been warned once, that he had been given a chance to walk away, but he had chosen to aim at someone who couldn't defend herself, and now he would have to live with the consequences of that choice. He said that from now on, no one in this city would dare do business with him, that he would have to leave and start again from nothing in a place where no one knew his name, and for a man who lived on reputation and fear like Calder, that was a punishment heavier than anything else. But the one who wounded Donovan most deeply, and the one he dealt with most coldly, was Sutton. He summoned him, and when Sutton walked in wearing a mask of forced calm, he understood at once that he had been exposed, because the way Donovan looked at him said everything. Donovan did not shout, did not spit out a single insult. He simply placed on the table the evidence of Sutton's meeting with Calder, the money that had changed hands, the entire conspiracy, and let the heavy silence speak for him. Then he said, in a voice so low and flat it was chilling, that throughout all those years he had treated Sutton like family, had trusted him and valued him, and that what disappointed him was not Sutton's ambition, because ambition was something he could understand, but the fact that Sutton had chosen the most cowardly way to satisfy it, aiming at an innocent woman and a child, instead of daring to face him like a man. He said that from this moment on, Sutton no longer had any place in his world, that every door once opened to him because of Donovan's name would now slam shut, and that he would be stripped of everything he had ever gained through Donovan's trust. Sutton tried to argue, tried to justify himself, but beneath Donovan's cold and unwavering stare, every word died in his throat. And in the end, he was taken out of the room, carrying the humiliation of a man who had traded everything away, only to lose it all. When both masterminds had been dealt with, each forced to bear the exact consequence born from his own cruelty, without a single drop of blood being spilled, Donovan stood silently in the room as it returned to stillness. And for the first time after many tense days, he let out a long breath, because he knew that the danger threatening the woman and the child he cherished had finally been erased completely. Just when it seemed the storm had finally quieted and Della could breathe again after those tense days, the illness that had been silently growing inside Briar's small body suddenly worsened, and the blow came so abruptly that Della almost had no time to prepare herself for it. One morning, the little girl no longer had enough strength to spring out of bed and run to hug her sister the way she always did. The eyes that usually sparkled were now tired, and with just one look at her, Della's heart tightened with a terrible premonition. She hurriedly brought her sister to the hospital, and when the doctors spoke to her in gentle but grave words, saying that Briar's condition had reached a stage where urgent intervention was needed, that she would require an intensive and costly treatment plan if they wanted to preserve the child's chance, Della felt as if the whole world were collapsing around her. She sat in the hospital corridor, her trembling hands clenched tightly together, and for the first time after so many years of forcing herself to be her sister's support, she felt small and helpless, to the point of despair. She had worked herself to exhaustion, had saved every coin, had given up everything she could, and yet now, faced with the number the hospital had given her, she understood that no matter how many extra shifts she worked, no matter how many more meals she skipped, she could never gather enough in the short time her sister needed. The greatest fear of her life, the fear she had always pushed down to the bottom of her heart and never dared to name, now stood towering before her eyes, and she dropped her head into her hands, letting the tears she had held back for so long finally spill out. She cried not because she was tired, not because she was poor, but because of the boundless pain of an older sister, a second mother, standing on the edge of losing the most precious thing in her life, and unable to do anything more. It was in that darkest, loneliest moment, when she thought she would have to carry all of it alone, that she felt a warm hand rest gently on her shoulder. She looked up, and through the blur of tears, she saw Donovan standing there. He had heard the news and come at once, but he did not come with the manner of someone arriving to bestow charity, not with a single word about money, not with any gesture that made her feel she was receiving alms. He simply sat down quietly in the chair beside her, there in his steady and calm presence, letting her know that she no longer had to face all of this by herself. He didn't offer empty words like, "Everything will be all right," because he understood better than anyone how hollow such words could sound to someone standing at the edge of an abyss. Instead, he only said softly that she wasn't alone, that no matter what happened, she wouldn't have to walk through it by herself, and that Briar was a strong child, strong exactly like her sister. Della looked at him, and in his eyes she did not see the pity she had always feared. She saw only a deep understanding, the understanding of someone who had once been helpless too, watching a person he loved fight against fate, someone who knew exactly what it felt like to stand there and be unable to do anything. And that quiet understanding, that presence that demanded nothing and judged nothing, became the support she needed more than anything in that darkest hour. She didn't have to say thank you, and he didn't need her to say it, because between them now there was a language of their own, woven from similar wounds and a wordless respect. When Della was allowed to visit her sister, Donovan walked with her all the way to the door of the room, and before she went inside, he gently squeezed her hand once, a small gesture that passed into her all the steadiness she had run dry of, as if he were sharing with her a part of his own strength. Stepping into the room, sitting down beside her sister's bed, Della took Briar's small hand and smiled through her tears, whispering to her that she was here, that she wasn't going anywhere, and that the two of them would get through this together. This time, she no longer had to hold everything up alone, because beyond that door, someone was standing quietly, ready to help her carry the sky that seemed ready to fall. What Donovan did in the days that followed showed Della just how deeply he truly understood her, because he did not simply pull out his wallet, pay the hospital bills, and place her in the position of someone indebted to him, something that, to her self-respect, would have felt like a new burden. Instead, he did something far wiser and far kinder. He opened doors for her that she had never even known existed. He connected Della with a medical assistance program for families in circumstances like hers, a real program she would have qualified for long ago, if only she had known about it and known how to reach it, helping the weight of Briar's treatment costs be shared in a rightful and dignified way. He introduced her to an excellent doctor in the field Briar needed, someone willing to treat the child according to the best proper plan. And most important of all, he offered her a new job, a decent position with a livable wage at one of his legitimate businesses, not as charity, but as a real job he knew she was fully capable of handling, so she could care for her sister with her own hands and her own dignity. At first, Della hesitated, because receiving too much made her uneasy, but Donovan spoke to her with a sincerity she could not refuse. He told her that he was not giving her anything she did not deserve, that he was simply helping open a door for her, while whether she stepped through it, and how she stepped through it, would still be entirely up to her. And Della stepped through that door in the only way she knew how, with all her effort and devotion. She worked at the new job with a diligence that made everyone around her respect her, caring for her sister while slowly rebuilding their life on a steadier foundation. During those same days, once Briar finally had access to the right treatment, her health began to improve little by little, and every sign of recovery from the child was like a ray of sunlight slipping into the dark season the two sisters had endured. One afternoon, for the first time in so long, Briar had enough strength to sit up and hold her colored pencils, and she drew with deep concentration. This time, the picture did not have only the two sisters and the house with the chimney anymore. There was also a tall man standing beside them, and when Della asked who he was, the little girl only gave a mischievous smile and refused to answer, making Della's heart warm softly. It was in that rare, peaceful silence, while she sat beside the bed watching her sister draw beneath the afternoon light, that Della quietly looked back on everything she had survived, and Donovan, who had now become an indispensable part of the two sisters' lives, slowly came to understand the full price this woman had silently paid for so many years. He learned that the sisters' parents had died when Della was still very young, that she had given up her own dreams, given up even her youth, to become the only support her little sister had. He learned that the meals she skipped so Briar could eat were not something occasional, but a habit that had stretched across an entire chapter of her life, that every coin she saved carried a sacrifice she had never told anyone about, never complained about for even half a word. This woman had borne all of it in silence, with a smile always waiting on her lips to protect her sister from the weight of reality. And the more Donovan understood, the deeper his respect for her became, because he realized that true strength did not lie in the power or fearsome reputation he had spent his whole life building. It lived in the quiet resilience of a person willing to give everything for someone she loved, without asking for anything in return. Nearly 1 year after the night when the coins were spread across the cold counter, Della once again stood before a cash register. But this time everything was different. She placed the money down to pay for a small dinner celebrating the day Briar's doctor officially told them the little girl had passed the dangerous stage and was recovering well, and this time Della's hands no longer trembled. She no longer had to count every coin in fear, no longer felt as though the whole world were holding its breath, waiting for her to come up short. She paid calmly, with her head held high, not because she was wealthy now, but because she had regained something far more precious than money, the peace and dignity of a person who had found the strength to stand on her own again. Beside her, Briar held her sister's hand, healthy and bright, her eyes sparkling once more like the sun-filled drawings she still loved to make. And standing on the other side of the little girl, holding her other small hand, was Donovan, the man who had carried the pain of losing his mother alone for 26 years, and had now found in these two sisters a home that neither power nor wealth had ever been able to give him. 3 people, each of them once carrying an emptiness of their own, now stood beside one another and filled those empty places for one another. And when Briar looked up and asked whether their family was having dessert tonight to celebrate, both Della and Donovan laughed. The words "their family," spoken so innocently by the child, said everything about what the 3 of them had become. Della remembered that fateful evening when a stranger had quietly placed the missing money on the counter without a single word of pity, and she understood that the gift he had given her that day had never been a few small bills. It had been something far greater, the feeling of being seen, of being respected as a whole human being at the very moment when she had believed she had become invisible to the entire world. And Donovan, for his part, also understood that the most precious thing he had ever done in his life of power was not any empire he had built, but the moment he chose to stop beside a woman counting her last coins, and decided that this time he would not turn his face away the way that entire room from long ago had done. This story, though told in the setting of a city and people who may feel unfamiliar, carries within it a truth very close to all of us, that a person's worth is never measured by how much money they have in their pocket, that poor working people who quietly sacrifice day after day for those they love deserve to be seen with respect, not pity, and that sometimes the greatest thing one person can do for another is not to give them money, but to stand on their side, protect them when they are vulnerable, and show them that they are not alone in this life. Kindness given at the right moment can change an entire fate, and a person's dignity, no matter how poor they may be, will always be a light that nothing can extinguish. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with someone you think needs to be heard today, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next healing stories we send to you every day. How do you feel about Della and Donovan's story, and what part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings that come from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your honest emotions. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to these final words. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.